Okay, we got a couple more people that just joined us, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Ariel Whitely-Noll. I am the horticulture agent for K-State Research and Extension in Shawnee County. We are doing these webinars sort of as our response to COVID, to the stay-at-home orders. Normally, our Shawnee County Extension Master Gardeners do excellent programs at the Topeka and Shawnee County Public Library. So since we're not able to do that face-to-face programming, we decided to move some of the programs that we already had planned online. So that's what this is, and we've had a really good turnout for it. So I think, a lot of us are sort of changing the way we do things, especially gardening, in light of COVID and these stay-at-home orders and social distancing. And I think sometimes we're finding that something really good comes out of it. And I think these webinars are something really good that has come out of it, sort of shown us all that webinars aren't that hard to do, and that when we are back in our offices, that it's something that hopefully we'll be able to continue. So before I get started with my presentation today, I just want to thank all of you that participated in the pre-test. We haven't asked you to do that before for webinars, but I am actually teaching this course. I plan to teach it at the library, but I'm also taking a master's class on teaching. And so that pre-test and the post-test that you'll take later are really helping me write what I hope to be an A+ paper on some modified teaching methods that I'm using. So I really appreciate your feedback in that. But also, I loved reading through your feedback. So I just wanted to talk about a couple things that you guys mentioned in your pre-test, because I think it's a really important way that we're going to set the stage for our learning that we're going to be doing today. So when asked what you guys did last year in the vegetable garden for pest and disease control, I had quite a few of you mention jets of water, hand picking. One person specifically said, I identify the specific problem and treat accordingly. Woo, woo, that's like my dream answer right there. Somebody actually mentioned integrated pest management, which we're going to talk a lot about today. That's a big feature of what we're talking about today. Quite a few of you mentioned a very specific chemical that you use in your garden. And then just the best answer I got all day was, I cuss the squash bugs. And I thought that was excellent. A lot of you seem to have a hatred for squash bugs, which is great. And we're going to talk about squash bugs today. For resources that you use, we are going to go over some great, reliable resources that you can use today. A couple people put my mom or my husband or my best friend, which is great because a lot of us are really fortunate to have that sort of go-to person in our life. So I was glad that you guys are using each other as resources. Quite a few people mentioned K-State resources. I have a feeling those are Extension Master Gardeners, but that's great. I always love to have people using research-based resources. And then a couple people actually mentioned selecting disease-resistant varieties, which is awesome. That's sort of an advanced topic that we're going to touch on today. So I was glad to see that that was something somebody was thinking about as they plan their garden. When I asked how you guys felt about chemicals, most people said something along the lines of fine, or I don't use them. I would say 90% of you said you use chemicals as a last resort, or you avoid them if possible, which is going to work really nicely into our integrated pest management plans when we talk about them. Because chemicals, as we're going to talk about later, are fine to use responsibly and sparingly, and as the final step in an integrated pest management plan. And then, of course, based on the preferences of the gardener. So I was glad to see you guys already have a lot of the concepts that we're going to talk about today. Specific pests and diseases, a lot of you are having tomato problems. Somebody mentioned the cabbage looper, cucumber beetles. Everything was one response, so hopefully we can help with that today. And then again, squash bugs. I'm so glad I used squash bugs as an example because it doesn't seem like anybody wants to keep squash bugs around in their garden. And then why did you want to take this course? To understand chemical control and how to apply it with minimal risk to people and wildlife. That again is like an answer that I would just put like a big glowing heart around. That's a great answer. Somebody was new to Kansas and wants to learn some techniques there. To know what pests and diseases look like, that's another great response because you want to know what you're treating before you treat it. To learn new techniques, and then a lot of you put that you just wanted to learn more. So with that foundation, that really helped me when I was putting the final touches right before we started on today's lesson to make sure that I'm able to teach you what hopefully you need to know. So I'll go ahead and get started. As we get started, if for any reason my video cuts out or goes away, just be patient with me and I'll try to log on. The afternoon can get a little bit dicey. It seems like everybody wants to sleep in during the day and then work in the afternoon. So just bear with me if for any reason I do lose internet connection. And then for those of you that have joined us on our other webinars, I will be stopping for questions. Feel free to leave me questions in the chat box. Or if I stop a couple of times, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask me questions then. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and get started. So this is vegetable pest and disease management. And the first thing I just need to say is that K-State is an affirmative action, equal opportunity employer. All of our programs and materials are open to everybody without regard to race, color, national origin, sex, gender, gender identity, religion, age, height, weight, disability, political beliefs, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, or veteran status. So that's a really long sentence just to say that our programs are open to everybody. So there are 4 main objectives that we will be going over today. The first is to understand the principles of integrated pest management, which I'm just going to refer to as IPM. We're going to understand the importance of each level in IPM, and then know where to find the information to create IPM plans for specific pests and diseases. So you want to understand the concept, but then we also want to be able to find that information so we can apply it to specific pests and diseases. And then finally, the most exciting part is that we will be using IPM principles, and we will actually take on each of your major pests and diseases and create those IPM plans and share as many of those plans as we have time for this afternoon. So what is integrated pest management? It is a comprehensive strategy, and while in the title is the name pest, it also applies to diseases. It's a multi-step process. We're going to go through each step today, and it spans the entire life of the plant. And truly, it actually begins before you even plant the plant when you're selecting resistant varieties or thinking about where you're going to put your garden. So it's a very comprehensive plan. It is proactive versus reactive. So we're going to talk a lot about if you go out in your garden and your plant is absolutely covered in squash bugs, at that point, it's too late to begin your integrated pest management plan for that plant, but you can start your plan for the next year. It's applicable to both pests and diseases, and typically a comprehensive, strong IPM plan results in limited to no chemical use. So for those of you that are just a little more visual, this is what we talk about when we're talking about an integrated pest management plan. Down at the bottom, we have our cultural practices. So we're scouting for insects, we're using jets of water, we're having plants that are properly spaced, properly fertilized, properly watered, so that they can avoid those issues to begin with. The next step in our integrated pest management plan involves biological control. So having a backyard habitat that's conducive to birds and spiders and beneficial insects and frogs and all those things that are going to help control specifically pest issues when we talk about biological control. Physical is the next level. That could involve removing an affected plant or pruning out affected stems. Anything, hand picking is another example of physical, anything that involves you taking something out of the equation. And then chemical control is the last resort. It's not a bad option, it's just the option that we want to leave after we've already planned and done everything else we need to do to take care of our plants. So these are the 7 steps of an integrated pest management plan, and I'm going to go into each in more detail. But the most important thing is that IPM starts before there's a problem. So if you could just walk away with one thing today, that would be the most important concept, that the IPM plan starts before you see a problem in your garden. So the first step in an integrated pest management plan is to plan around disease and pest issues. So that's where you use your Kansas Garden Guide, which is free online. If you don't have a printed off copy, you can just look up Kansas Garden Guide, or you can go to our website, which is shawnee.ksu.edu. And on our gardener resources page, and then our vegetables and herb page, we have a copy of the Kansas Garden Guide. That's really going to help you research each plant. So you need to have an IPM plan for your squash, for your tomatoes, for your cucumbers. Each plant you plant needs to have its own plan based on the most common problems. You can't always plan for everything. Sometimes you just get that weird disease, or the weird environmental issue that you couldn't plan for. But when it comes to the common things, you definitely want to have a plan in place. Resources like the Kansas Garden Guide are also going to help you select varieties that are disease and pest resistant. And that's going to be huge when it comes to the really difficult to control things like the squash bug. You want to know the symptoms to watch for so that when you're out in your garden, you're constantly scouting. And then you want to place them appropriately in the garden. A lot of times when we're looking at pests, if you have a whole row of basil, just 30 basil plants all in a row, that's going to make it so much easier for pests and diseases to find that basil than if your basil is mixed in with your tomatoes and your cucumbers and maybe your flowers in your flower bed. So when we're talking about placing appropriately, oftentimes we're talking about avoiding that monoculture approach. And then you want to create a garden rich with plant, insect, and animal diversity. So this gorgeous garden spider, I just wish that they would stop making webs right directly outside of my door so that I walk into them at 7 in the morning, which is terrifying. But other than that, we all want to have these beautiful spiders in our garden, ladybugs, all the things that can really help us with specifically pest control. And that all happens in the planning of your garden. Next, we want to monitor and look for common symptoms. So you know the symptoms to look for, which could be specks on the lower leaves. It could be leaves that are completely missing, like with the tomato hornworm. They're just going to completely take away a leaf. And every time you're interacting with your plants, that is a time to monitor and to look for symptoms. So when you're watering your plants, you're weeding your plants, you're harvesting your plants, I do a lot of monitoring and looking for symptoms at times when I'm not even interacting with my plants. You know, right now we've had such a wet spring, I'm not going out to water every morning, but maybe I'm going out to play with my dog or going out just to go talk to my neighbor. And those are times that I am still looking at my vegetable plants in particular and scouting for pests and diseases that I think may be popping up based on the most common diseases for those plants. The third and probably the most challenging step is to identify the pest or disease. This is really hard. This is not something that you're just going to be able to get overnight because there's so many pests and diseases that could affect the plant, depending on what it is. So that's a time, we're going to talk a little bit more about it later, when our master gardeners can help on the response line to help you whittle down exactly what that pest or disease is. Because once you're able to identify it, treatment is typically much more simple than specifically identifying the pest or disease. So this is a great example. This is something that we're getting some calls on right now in our office, the difference between termites and ants. So if you find a small winged creature in your kitchen and you think it could be an ant, but it also could be a termite, your control measures are going to look vastly different. You know, if it turns out that you have some ants in your kitchen, well, that's a fairly common problem that a lot of us encounter. Maybe you're going to put out some bait stations, but most likely you'll just try to clean up, you know, a little bit of the crumbs or whatever else you have out that they may be attracted to. If it turns out you have a termite infestation in your home, that's going to be a significantly different problem and a different reaction for you, the homeowner, on the part of control. So that's why identification is so important. You would hate to be the person that thought you had ants and had termites in your home for many, many years. And I think you'd also hate to be the person that wasted a lot of money spraying or treating for termites when in reality, the only thing you had was ants. So identification is really important. And then you also want to evaluate your damage. And I see this is where a lot of our homeowners that call into the response line get tripped up a little bit. So you need to determine your plant's threshold for tolerance. And this is really kind of the cool part about integrated pest management, is the only person that can determine your plant's tolerance is you. So on the left, we have a pear tree, and on the right, we have a rose bush. And I'm realizing now that as I'm talking, I hope that that's your left and your right. But right here is the pear with the rust, and this is black spot on roses. So if this rose bush is, and some of you have heard me use this example before, is down by your mailbox, and you live in a beautiful neighborhood where everybody has perfectly manicured lawns, and it suddenly gets these black spots that completely cover it, your threshold for your plant having that disease is probably going to be pretty low. You purchased the rose bush because you wanted it to look beautiful, and it doesn't look beautiful if it's completely covered in black spots. So that's going to be a disease that you're likely going to want to take maybe significant steps to control. The pear, however, with the rust, if the reason you have the pear tree is just to get fruit and you're still getting an adequate crop of pears, do you really care that it has orangey yellow spots on the leaves? Perhaps not. So that might be an instance where you're saying, this is an ornamental rose bush. I want to take significant steps to control this disease. This is a pear tree. I'm still getting fruit, so I don't want to take any steps or maybe minimal steps to control this disease. In both instances, it's not going to be anything that kills the plant. Most times when we're talking about a disease or an insect that kills the plant, everyone's tolerance is going to be fairly low for tolerating that pest or disease. The fifth step in the integrated pest management plan is to determine the need for control. So you're evaluating that damage, you're figuring out if you want to do something about it based on your use for that plant. And then you want to determine, based on what control is recommended, is the damage worth controlling. So Japanese beetles are a plague many of us have experienced. They're not native. They're very invasive, very aggressive. They typically have a lifespan of about 4 to 6 weeks. So when people call our office and they want to spray for Japanese beetles, if they started seeing Japanese beetles 2 weeks ago and they're calling our office wanting to spray, what we talk them through is you're going to have to spray every 2 to 3 days, depending on the product, for the next 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, depending on how long those Japanese beetles' life cycle goes on. So that's where that individual person needs to determine, I really don't have the money to do that. I don't have the time to do that. I don't want to spray pesticides that often, that much. And maybe your next door neighbor decides, I hate Japanese beetles. I want each and every one of them to die. Yes, I am willing to spray every 2 to 3 days until they're gone. So that need for control is sort of based on your evaluation, but it's also based on your personal preferences. And we have a lot of people that call our office that choose to take other steps, such as hand-picking Japanese beetles or netting specific plants that are really valuable to them. So it's not just chemical control or not, but you do have to determine your individual need for control before you start to take those steps. And then number 6, consider all control methods. So for the Japanese beetles, hand picking is very effective. Jets of water will knock them off the plant but not kill them. But for some plants like aphids, jets of water can be very effective at killing them, or at least making it so that it's extremely difficult for them to get back onto the plant. Pruning is another example of a way that you can control pests or diseases. And all 3 of those would be considered physical control. So pretty low when we think about that pyramid of IPM. Those would all be physical control. Chemical control is always going to be our last resort. And when we talk about our specific examples, you're going to see where that comes into play. And as part of a plan that you have that started before you even put your plants in your ground, you'll see that chemical control is the last resort. And then 7, this is a step that's often forgot, but just really important: monitor and adjust. So you may need to have repeat applications or methods and make needed adjustments. A really good example, we had an aphid problem in our Master Gardener greenhouse this year. We bought in some plugs, we treated them. They ended up bringing us a couple aphids, and they're really difficult to control, especially in the greenhouse. So our greenhouse manager first started by spraying jets of water, which is recommended on the K-State publication. So she sprayed jets of water on the affected flats. She did that every day for a few days. It worked okay, and then the pest population just got out of control. So that's when she stepped it up to a horticultural oil, and that was somewhat effective, but not effective enough. And then we had to step it up to a more potent chemical based on that K-State recommendation. So that's where we really went with the least lethal option and the non-chemical option, and slowly had to increase our treatment of aphids just because they were getting out of hand. So often, if left unattended, that one little caterpillar will reproduce, will create more. And so it's really important that as you go along, you are monitoring and adjusting. So before I go on to the next part, I just want to make sure that we do not have any questions in the chat box. We don't have any right now, but I will take a pause and allow everybody to unmute and ask questions if you have them. I will even stop sharing because it's awkward to stare at my screen and ask a question. But the integrated pest management's a really important concept. So if you have any questions about those steps, now is a good time to ask them. Okay.
This is Reggie.
Oh, hi, Reggie.
This is Reggie. How are you, Ariel?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. You said that one important step is to identify pest problems before we have them. Will you help me with that?
Yes. So that's an important step and it's a difficult step. So I would have 3 recommendations for you to help you with identification. The first is that when you're creating your integrated pest management plan at the beginning of the year, when you're planning your garden, that you use some of the resources I'll talk about later, such as the Kansas Garden Guide. And let's use tomato as an example. So you want to look at the most common pests and the most common diseases for tomato. And that's going to help you, before you have the problem, sort of know, okay, I need to look for yellowish circles on lower tomato leaves. I need to look for totally missing leaves, which, like I said, could be the tomato hornworm. I need to make sure that I don't get brown lesions on the bottom of the tomato fruit, blossom end rot. So sort of at the beginning of the year, you're just running through with yourself, what are the most common things I may encounter with a tomato, so that as you start the season, you know what's right and what's not right. So that's the first part. The next part is if you do encounter something and you're not sure what it is, that's when you can call us, or for those of you that aren't Shawnee County residents, call your local extension office and we can help you walk through some of those things. And then the third part, because we're all here because we're lifelong learners and we like to learn, and it may not be our preference just to call somebody when you don't know the answer, is we're actually getting ready to dive into a great resource that K-State provides. And it can be great for making your integrated pest management plan. But what I'll start off talking about is actually how you can also use it to identify the problems that you have.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
So to make sure I understand, you saying go through and check and realize what problems you might have before you know, like when you're planting or before you plant, when you're deciding what to plant and where. And you also are saying, look for the small signs of a potential problem that's presenting itself as soon as it presents itself. So pay attention to the small things at the very beginning of the growing cycle.
Absolutely.
Am I getting that?
You've got it spot on.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. I'll get started with the next part, and that's actually a wonderful transition to the next part of the presentation rather. Okay. So this is K-State's Common Plant Problems page. And I'm going to have you guys, if you're able to on your devices, pull this up a little bit later. I know for some of you that are on tablets or phones, that might be difficult. But this is a great resource. And the way we're going to use it today is going to be primarily by already knowing your problem and then coming to the plant problems page and pulling up the publication on the problem you've already identified and then reading through control. But what's great about this page is, like we were just talking about, you can also use it to help you identify the problem that you're not sure what it is. So this page is sorted alphabetically. It doesn't always make sense. There are a couple diseases that are like listed by their Latin names, which makes it a little bit difficult. But for the most part, they're listed by their common names in a way that makes a lot of sense. So in the example we were just discussing, if you are going to, if you have a problem on your tomato and you're not sure what it was, you would click on the T here. It would take you down to the T on this page. This is just a screenshot of the page. And when it does, you would be able to look at all the common, now it's not all the problems you could ever have with tomatoes, but all the common problems with tomatoes, so that you can see that septoria leaf spot is a common problem, that bacterial speck is a common problem. And tomatoes is kind of an expansive one. A lot of your other vegetables are going to be easier. But by going down to the T for tomato and reading through each of those, you will be able to go through and figure out, okay, well, it's definitely not, you know, tomato hornworm because I'm not missing any leaves. And it's definitely not bacterial speck because the spots don't look like that, or they're in the wrong place on the plant. So this is a good resource for making your plan once you've identified the problem, but you can also work backwards with it and use it as a way to figure out what your problem is. And I see I had a chat question, so I just want to make sure. Kevin and I have had a conversation about ants before, and he was just letting me know that a flamethrower is very effective in controlling giant mutant ants. Kevin's been teaching me about old movies, which I appreciate, and the giant ants was one of them. So now is the much anticipated portion that you've all been waiting for, which is how to kill squash bugs. So I pick squash bugs because they are a major vegetable pest. So using this page, the Common Plant Problems in Kansas page, I clicked on S, and it gave me a list of all the common plant problems that start with S. And this is not just for vegetables. This is all the common plant problems that one of our specialists has compiled for us to use. So I found squash bugs and I clicked on it, and this is the first page and this is the second page of the squash bug publication. So what's great about this plant problems page is that they put the description and the solution in a very succinct way, because nobody wants to read a 40-page book on squash bugs. You want to know what it is and how to get rid of it very, very quickly. So for the purpose of this example, I, as the gardener, am struggling with squash bugs on, let's say, my squash plants specifically, because while pumpkin is a squash, they've listed that separately for clarity reasons. So first thing I want to do is read through the description. I'm looking at the photos. I see that adult squash bugs can move within the field. They can overwinter in weeds. I'm reading about the eggs. So this description portion is really helping me identify the problem to make sure that maybe I didn't mix up the squash bug with the cucumber beetle or something similar. So I've read through the description and I'm certain that this is the problem that I've been encountering in my garden. So then I want to go down to the recommendations page. So the first recommendation is to have squash varieties resistant to squash bugs. So butternut, royal acorn, and sweet cheese. That's great because that is starting my integrated pest management plan before I even planted the plants. So let's say in 2019, I had a horrible squash bug problem. I'm planning my garden for 2020 and I decide to go with butternut because I want to avoid squash bug problems. Now the downside to these recommended varieties is if I want to grow pumpkin, they did not list a resistant variety to pumpkin, which means we haven't found a pumpkin variety that's resistant. So that is the downside to disease and pest resistance, is there's not always the option that you want to grow. But if I'm okay with butternut, if I'm okay with royal acorn or sweet cheese, then that's a great first step in my squash bug plan. Now I'm going to go on and continue to read about the squash bugs. I'm reading more about how the eggs get darker in color, which if we're looking at the prior page, this is a great illustration. This is what I should be scouting for, is these little clusters, because it's very unlikely that I'll actually see an adult squash bug. So I'm looking for those eggs to get darker just before they hatch. And then I need to treat when most of the eggs have hatched, when the nymphs are still small to medium in size. And again, this picture, this is going to be my target. As I go on to read, the adult squash bug is very difficult to kill. So having this photo of what the nymph looks like, that's what I'm scouting for so that I know what to treat. So treat when most of the eggs have hatched and when the nymphs are still small to medium size. Place a piece of board or shingles on the ground near the plant. And what that does is squash bugs like to gather in sort of a sheltered area. So if you put down a board or you put down a shingle, they're gonna gather under that spot. And when you come through the treat, all you have to do is lift up the border shingle and spray in that one area. That can be a way when you're using chemical control to make sure that you don't have to spray your entire vegetable garden for squash bugs. You can just spray a couple concentrated areas and get the majority of the squash bugs. Adult squash bugs have a hard protective shell, and so it's really difficult to treat them when they're adults. This is why the integrated pest management plan is so important. If I had a squash bug problem and I wait until July of 2020 when I see adult squash bugs running around before I begin treatment, it's likely that there's nothing I can do. I can try to use some sprays to kill the adults, but I will have already missed the eggs. I will already have missed the nymphs. I didn't plant a resistant variety. So as you can see, I would have already missed really critical steps prior to reading this publication. And then it just goes on to talk specifically about how to apply the insecticides and then what insecticides to spray depending on the life stage. So you can see this is why squash bugs are so difficult to control. It's not just see a squash bug, spray a squash bug. It really begins with selecting it, with looking for the eggs, with waiting until they hatch, with spraying the proper things for the proper life cycle. And that's why so many of us struggle with squash bugs. They're a very difficult example. But as you can see, the publication really walks me through that integrated pest management plan. Now, if I'm completely opposed to using any insecticides, what that means is I need to pay really careful attention to these eggs and remove them. Rather than waiting to see if they hatch, I need to remove them. And if I'm really opposed to using chemicals, I need to either not plant squash if I've had squash bugs problems, knowing that they're probably going to get out of hand and I may not be able to handle it. Or hope for the best, scout as much as I can, remove those eggs, and then just accept the fact that if I do get some adults and they do kill my plants, then that's just part of my, maybe I have an organic garden and that's just part of it, and I try to move on to something else. So that can be the difficult thing if you're completely opposed to chemical control, but that's why you want to know those beginning steps so that you can work really hard so you don't hopefully have to get to that chemical control step. So this just kind of outlines from that publication my squash bug plan. So I'm looking specifically at the squash bug if I'm planting squash or pumpkin. I'm going to plant those resistant varieties if that's what I want. When we're monitoring and look for common symptoms, it's going to be these eggs that I'm looking for. Of course, if I see an adult squash bug, that's an indication that I have a squash bug problem. But specifically, I'm looking for the eggs as I'm scouting. And then to properly identify it, I already looked at the publication, so I know what it looks like. Now, evaluate damage is tricky with squash bugs. If you have high squash bug publications, they will cause your plants to die and wilt. They can also reduce yields. They can have lower quality fruit. So if what I'm doing is planting squash because I want to have a lot of squash, I am going to have a very low tolerance for squash bugs. I'm going to say that my tolerance for squash bugs is going to be 0. I don't want a single squash bug in my garden. So when we're evaluating for damage, it's going to be very low based on the severity of what that insect means for the squash plants. So determine the need for control. I have a low tolerance for damage, so I absolutely am going to control. And then this just walks us through the control methods that I have decided I feel comfortable with. I'm going to treat them when the nymphs are young. I'm going to place that board down so that I can concentrate them in one area and spray. And then I'm going to make sure that I'm spraying the correct product for the correct stage of the insect. And then this fourth step is at the end of that publication. If I have a bad squash bug population, in 1 year, I'm going to remove all the vines, all the fruit of the squash plants, completely till them in or take them away from my garden so that those nymphs don't have a food source to go into the next year. And then monitor and adjust. Really, if I'm seeing those adult squash bugs, I have very little that I can do, but perhaps hand picking or continuing the couple of sprays that are somewhat effective on the adults. I'm just going to pull up the chat here. So Bessie asked, can you use oil on the eggs? It's not mentioned in the publication, so I would say that I can't say that that would necessarily be effective. Good question. Okay, now I'm going to talk about a disease and go through a similar plan. Are there any questions about kind of what I went through specifically on the squash bug, about how I used that publication to make my integrated pest management plan? Okay. So bacterial leaf spot on peach. This is what that looks like. It's kind of a grainy picture, but it's no fun if you're a peach grower. So again, I'm going to go to the common plant problems in Kansas page. I'm going to click on the P, and that's where I will find the bacterial leaf spot. It'll say peach, comma, bacterial leaf spot. And when I pull up the publication, this is the treatment that I get. This is a much easier disease to treat because there are so many resistant varieties. So as you can see, these are all varieties that are resistant. The problem here, because it's a peach tree, is that if I already have a peach tree and I ask you, or I go to look, what can I do to prevent bacterial speck? It's not going to warm my heart to know that what I should do is cut down my tree and plant another. So the other option they have here is monitor fertility needs. So there's good news and there's bad news. There's not a lot you can do if you don't have a resistant variety and you already have that tree. The good news is that there are a lot of resistant varieties. So maybe it's a plan that you plant one of these resistant varieties this year and then plan to maybe remove the variety you have over the next 5 years or so. So that's a much simpler version than the squash bug version. Sometimes our integrated pest management plans are actually quite small, resistant varieties, and monitor fertility. And other times, like with the squash bugs, they're much more comprehensive with something in each step of the integrated pest management plan. So now is the really fun part. I would like each of you to create an integrated pest management plan. So today we're specifically talking about vegetables. Some of you did have some questions about non-vegetable pests. And if we have time at the end, I would love to show you some resources and dive into some of those. But today we're specifically looking at vegetable diseases or pests. So I would like you to visit the Plant Problems website if you're able to. I understand if you're on a phone or a tablet that might be a little bit difficult. So let me know if we need to make some adjustments here. You can use this website, or you can simply Google KSRE plant problems. And I always like to know what to Google to be able to pull up these pages. So if you Google that, it'll be the first page, and it should take you to a page that looks exactly like this. I want you to think about a problem that you had in your vegetable garden last year, either a disease or a pest. So maybe that's something you already know what it is, or maybe like in our tomato example, you need to first figure out what the problem was that you had. So find a problem that's a vegetable problem, click on the publication, and then just with a notepad or in the notes section of your phone, jot down what you want your integrated pest management plan to be. And the really important part when you're creating your plan is you do not just need to write down everything that K-State says you need to do. Like we talked about with the squash bug, if you're not comfortable using chemicals, or maybe you don't have the money to purchase the chemicals, it's not in your budget for the year, make your plan reflect what you truly intend to do as opposed to just what the publication says, because that's the reality of our situation. I know I give out a lot of publications and that people aren't always following every step of that because they're gardening according to their preferences. And then if we have time at the end, I would love for a few or everybody to be able to share at least a little bit of their plan with the rest of the class. So I am going to stop sharing my screen, and please let me know what questions you have as we are researching and working. And I will put in the chat box what it is that I wanted you to Google to get to that page. Okay, who else wants to share their integrated pest management plan?
I'll go.
Okay.
I chose tomatoes, and I chose that they uh, were slow to ripen or failing to ripen.
Mm-hmm.
And I lucked out because my whole management plan is to watch the weather and just keep them watered. And once the weather improves, so that so it's not too hot, they will start to ripen again. So I
Awesome.
really don't have to have much of a plan other than watering and watching weather.
And I'm so glad that you picked that one, Brenda, because that's one that I think maybe not a lot of people would have picked, but it's so common. And if you look at other tomato problems, many of them, the solution either is or can be helped by consistent watering. So you might kind of take care of a couple problems in one just by providing that good irrigation. So that's a great one to pick.
Thanks.
Who else wants to share their plan?
Okay.
Gilbert, you want to go?
Yeah, I picked tomatoes too, and I was wondering about the blight at the bottom of tomatoes. So you got to make sure you get the right kind of tomatoes and get them in the sun, and kind of keep them watered like Brenda was saying, or bet. Oh, yeah, Brenda. I guess I'm sorry. And then keep checking them. And somebody told me yesterday you should put the eggshells in there, which helps with that. But it said here to use something like a VO top fungicide on that, which would help prevent that. Because I get a lot of that brown at the bottom of the tomatoes. So that's what I had.
That's great, Gilbert, that you were actually to figure out, the eggshell thing's a really common thing. And while eggshells make a great organic matter to add, it's a wives' tale that they're going to help with calcium. You'd have to have a lot to change that. And most likely in our soils, it's actually the pH that's the problem. So I'm glad you were able to take that sort of piece of information that you picked up and figured out this actually isn't going to help me, but something else could. So that's awesome. That's great, Gilbert. Who else has a plan that they would like to share?
Hey, Ariel, it's Allison.
There.
What's your plan?
Are you talking to me, Ariel?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Actually, I used this. We had raised beds last year, and then I had items in patio pots. And I found my tomatoes. I was getting wonderful vines, but no tomatoes. So I used this information and I switched, and I have my tomatoes in the big patio pots so I could move them around, and then used my raised beds for other parts of my vegetable garden.
That's great. So it actually helped you plan your garden out.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Fantastic. I'm so glad to hear so many of you are starting at the beginning, which I think is when we get a lot of those calls into the response line, it's often too late. They didn't start with some of those early steps. So that's fantastic. Who else would like to share a plan?
I'll go.
Great.
So I picked tomatoes too. And one problem was those hornworms. But, I like the sphinx moths, are pretty cool. So I kind of like having them around. And I only had just a couple plants, and I'm only going to have a couple this year too. So I'm just going to watch real close for the caterpillars and hand pick them. And so that's how I'm going to control them. And then the other thing with tomatoes is that blossom end rot, and which I always heard that it was a lack of calcium. But then the publication is telling you that, well, maybe not. It could be a pH problem with your soil, and because it's not able to take up enough nitrogen. And the other thing is keeping consistent soil moisture, which I know was a problem for me when last time I planted tomatoes. So this year I'll make sure and start with some nice fresh soil so I know it's, you know, some good healthy soil. You know, fertilize. You know, kind of pay a little more attention to that, and the watering too.
Watering's about the best.
Yep. That's great. I love that you picked that, Kevin, because I think it had some good overlap with Gilbert's problem and then also Brenda's problem. So this is what I love about you guys getting to design your own plans, because it works out so much better than if I pick stuff. But if you can see, you know, you all picked tomatoes, but you picked a different problem. And by going through and making those plans, you're going to see that it's not that I'm doing 20 things for each disease. A lot of those cultural practices are the same. And I have not found really any cultural practices within the same plant that conflict. So I think that's fantastic that you guys are showing those relationships.
Yeah, you kind of can't go wrong taking good care of your plants.
Exactly. What were you going to say, Brenda?
I wanted to know if you could actually pick off those hornworms and then move them to another plant. Is there another plant that they could be moved
That's
to?
a great question. They like plants in the nightshade family, but tomatoes seem to be their favorite. One suggestion that I've heard, because they are beautiful moths, so people that love pollinators sometimes have a really hard time killing the hornworms themselves. So one option to save your tomatoes is actually to have like a sacrificial tomato plant. And this works really well if you have a lot of tomatoes. If you only have one or two, that's not really practical. But with the sacrificial plant, you want to give it a lot of nitrogen. And if you give it a lot of nitrogen, it's going to be less likely to produce fruit or not produce as much fruit, because nitrogen tells plants leaves, just keep creating leaves. But you'll actually notice that that tomato plant that you give more nitrogen to will turn dark green, will have more leaves, and those sphinx moths, they just cannot help themselves. That is the plant they want to have their babies on. And they lay the eggs there, and that's going to be the plant that they take over. Then if you do happen to find a couple that ended up on your other plants, you can move them over. That's a great question.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
They love that dark green. It's like what do they say? A moth to a flame. It's a moth to the dark green.
Right. Well, right, because I mean, you don't want to have really, if you have other plants around that are going to be good host plants besides your tomatoes, then you're just kind of bumping up the population of the pests that you're trying to control.
And then it's less favorable for the moth, but if anybody has chickens or particularly likes birds are all about that big juicy caterpillar. So that can be another way to dispose of the problem in kind of a non-traditional but very effective way. So that's great. Who else has a plan they would like to share? Anybody pick a vegetable that wasn't tomato or something we haven't touched on? I know tomato's big.
I did. I realize it's not really a pest or disease, though. I have had trouble with bitter cucumbers and looked at that and found that the pH for your soil needs to be between 6 and 6.5. And I just did a soil test, so I know that mine's not quite there. And it said that newer varieties of cucumbers are less likely to become bitter, so we'll choose a newer variety. And then adding organic matter and mulching and lots of water, especially during the summer heat, and just watching it is what it said to do.
That's great. And I love that you picked one that wasn't a pest or disease, because you're still able to use that plant problem site to figure out what it is. So that's great. And that's a problem I've heard a lot of people have. Awesome. Anybody else that'd like to share their plan today?
I can.
Okay, great, Callista.
I chose tomatoes and stink bug damage.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned that there's not really a whole lot I can do because they generally stay short term. But I've had problems with them long term, so I went looking elsewhere. And something that might work is row covers, and then also a specific variety. It was H something. It had a scientific name. I can't remember what it was. But anyway, it is almost 100% repelled by some essential oils such as clove, lemongrass, and spearmint.
That's
I found that
awesome.
interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that stink bug, at least in the calls I've gotten, has been obscure. So I think that's really interesting that you can keep having problems with it. But yeah, row covers, absolutely. That would be a good example of a physical control and just stepping it up as you're continuing to have problems. That's great. Okay, well, I did want to touch on a couple of things that you guys mentioned in your pre-survey. A lot of people mentioned wildlife damage problems and bagworms, and then tree and shrub problems. Let's see if I can do this without yanking my headphones out. For tree and shrub, K-State has a great book called Tree and Shrub Problems in Kansas. See if I can get that as close as possible. Again, it's another one. We're just looking up KSRE, tree and shrub problem. I'll do that again there so you can see it. This is an excellent publication for diagnosing the problem. And how it's organized, the only thing you have to know to be able to use it is what is the plant. So let's use ash as an example. Right here on the left-hand side, you can't see it, but just trust me, it says ash. And then it begins to list all the potential problems with ash along with their description. So this can be a great way of diagnosing the tree and shrub problem that you have. And then you follow up with that plant problem page to actually look at what the solution would be. Maybe it's emerald ash borer, maybe it's ash lilac borer, something like that. So the tree and shrub publication actually helps you figure out what it is. And then the plant problem page will help you with how to treat it. And the reason a lot of our heftier publications like this is another one that's free online, but you can pay for a hard copy. It's kind of a thick guy. The reason they don't have chemical recommendations is because chemical recommendations expire so quickly, change product names, or we found something that's more effective. So those tend to just be the publications we keep online so that we can continually update them without having to reprint a large publication. So that's tree and shrub, which a few of you mentioned. Bagworms and wildlife. When I send out the post survey later this afternoon, I will include resources for both of those because they are really common. We have a great wildlife specialist, Charlie Lee, and he actually has an index of wildlife problems, groundhogs, squirrels, rabbits, all of those things that I will send to you guys, so you are welcome to peruse that. They can definitely be major pests of our vegetable gardens. I know rabbits personally. If the squirrels aren't digging up what I planted in my vegetable garden, the rabbits are coming through and mowing it down. So those animal pests can definitely be significant. That is everything I have today. Like I said, I'll follow up with some resources in our post survey. Do any of you have any questions before we log out today? Christine, it shows up that you're speaking, but we can't hear what you're saying. You might try typing it in the chat box. Okay, I will wait here and see if Christine types her question in the chat box. Otherwise, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will post this online for anybody that missed it. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. Great.
Thank you, Ariel.
On IPM.
Thank you, Ariel.
You're welcome.
Great presentation. I learned a lot.
Yay.
Yes, it was a wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Reggie.
All right. See ya.
Bye. Oh, awesome. See you later, Christine. Bye.